I'm very pleased to introduce Judith Donath, who is here from MIT. She is professor at the Media Lab there, and she is also directing the Sociable Media Group. Judith's work, to me, is particularly important because she's addressing issues of information in relation to building social environments and actually taking information and bringing back people, emotions, humanity, all these things that have been divorced from data and information stream. And it's amazing to see how little of that is going on, and particularly in the art field, art world, media arts. So Judith is actually seeing this as a new form of architecture that media artists are going to work on, and her work is pioneering in this respect, and I'd like you to help me welcome her.
Hi. So anyway, tonight what I'm doing is talking about a lot of the underlying ideas behind our work, and mostly in the guise of discussing a number of current topics that students in my research group are doing. As Victoria mentioned, I run a research group called Social Media, and what we're really interested in doing is thinking about the problem of, in some ways we see ourselves a little bit like avant-garde. Did we get that? Let's start that way. You may have to repeat for our straight Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I think I'll be talking about current work here and some of the ideas behind it. That's the brief version. But anyway, so a lot of what we're interested in is the problem of how people get a sense of other people online, how you get a sense of the identity of other people. And in some ways, a lot of the theory behind that, for those of you who are, for instance, know anything about the history of artificial intelligence, it's of relevance not only to building better interfaces, but in some ways to having a better understanding of how society works. People know that there's a lot of jokes about artificial intelligence. That was a field in which so many of the promises never came true. But one of the things that's always fascinated me about AI is that how much we learned about how much more complex so many of these problems were. Marvin Minsky, who's one of the founders of both the AI Lab and the Media Lab, I think sometime in the early 70s gave an undergraduate student a summer problem, the problem of solving machine vision, because it seemed really easy. You know, you have an eye, you can make a camera act like an eye, and then you just take the objects out, and there you have vision. 25 years later, this problem is still not solved. It turned out to be much, much harder, but the process of going through step by step by step through realizing, well, yes, the retinal image is this nice little simple 2D thing, but how we actually get vision out of that is really hard. It involves not just understanding that image that's coming in, but the underlying knowledge and how it's represented, and that you actually spend years learning how to see, and that you have to be able to have a knowledge of the world in order to make that image make sense, etc. It was one of the really key contributions of artificial intelligence to our understanding how people think. So one of the fundamental questions here that I want you to keep in mind is that I'm going to be showing you some interfaces, and frankly, they are going to be very primitive. We're still at the very beginning of understanding what types of interfaces for conversation, etc., online are like, but really think about it not just in terms of, I know a lot of you are designers, not just in terms of designing like the next better product, but at that level of thinking that what you're designing here are real experiments in understanding what the nature of communication is, what the nature of society is, and how people make sense of each other. So the first thing I'm going to show you is a set of experiments we've been doing in the area of interfaces for conversation. Now, if you spend any time at all online, you realize that basically conversation is what people do there. If you have a universe in which people don't really have any bodies and don't exist, what you're doing is exchanging information. Here's sort of what a typical text conversation. This is actually a transcript of a chat with the author of Snow Crash. And it's actually a little bit interesting. It's actually a moderated chat, so it actually has full sentences, unlike most chats. But one of the things you'll realize is it's like hard to tell who's speaking. You don't really have the sense of a real conversation, etc. We can go on and on about what some of the drawbacks of text are. There's some very wonderful things about text conversations. But for instance, just to highlight a few, it's very hard to see the rhythms of the conversations. There's a lot of things about how people naturally interact with each other. All the subtle things that go into a conversation, besides the actual exchange of words, are missing. I've been a part of an online community for over 3 years now that sends, a huge number of letters back and forth to each other, and is a fairly, I've met some of the people on it, but there's like 5 women on this group named Lisa, and I cannot tell them apart. And I have them mixed up because the identity cues that I have for understanding who they are very limited. Now, one solution to things like, for instance, that problem, say, well, these identity cues are limited, is that we're very good at, for instance, remembering faces. After giving this talk for an hour, if I ran into any of you in the street again, I might not remember exactly where I saw you, but I would definitely recognize you again. And you certainly, after watching me for an hour, are going to recognize me. But faces in the interface are very problematic. And I'm going to be showing you a bunch of very abstract interfaces and that we've designed in lieu of using faces. And I just want to talk about some of the problems we perceive in it, even though for many applications, bringing faces in is something that is very desirable. One comes up with the notion that sometimes one of the things, for instance, Howard Rheingold, for those of you who've read his writing, one of the things he writes about a lot is one of the great things about the online world is that you don't necessarily have the same identity cues about people that you have in the real world. For instance, when you meet someone in the real world, what are the first things you know about them? Well, you know their gender. You have a pretty good idea of their age. You have a good idea of their height, and you know their race. And you can get all of those things from faces. Now, Victoria and I were having an interesting discussion about this afternoon. Now, whether or not this is desirable is a very, very complex topic. If you're developing an ideal world, those might not be the parameters that you might ideally want to know about people first off. So one of the really interesting possibilities raised in online worlds is saying, well, what are the first things you ought to know about someone? And then hear their words, etc. So that's some of the things we're exploring. Obviously, it's not that simple an answer to say, well, we can eliminate stereotypes and prejudices by not letting people know what other people's race and gender are, because those things do change how you relate to each other in the real world. There's very interesting studies where people are very, very good at telling gender online, even when people are trying to hide it, because so many of the learned nuances of gender really do come through in the way you speak. So hiding it, for instance, can make people seem much more aggressive or much more passive than they are, because your assumptions of passivity have to do with learned voices, etc. So I'm not saying that you would never ever want to know these things, but that as a designer, one of the things you have an opportunity to build is to make your choices about what people know first about someone. So and then there's a number of other things about faces. I want to show you just some examples you're probably familiar with of typical online worlds. This is one of the, when people start moving into a visual realm. One of the things that's nice about going into a more visual representation than text is, for instance, you can see how many people are around. In that previous one, you have no idea. There could have been 500 people listening, just the way I have no idea, there might be 2 people in cyberspace listening. There could be hundreds of you out there. Anyway, once you have a graphical interface, you usually have, the interface is usually set up so you know how many people are there. But if you look at this, frankly, this is not the way, there's a lot of limitations about being shown as a cartoon figure or even a realistic one, some of which, here you don't have that same issue because you say, well, I can pick whoever I want to be, but your words still come out having some expression. I'm going to just skip this one. This is from a study in how to do, it's a book called Comics and Sequential Art. And it's by Will Eisner, who's one of sort of the fathers of cartooning. And he has a whole series of these. What I think is very interesting here is these are very, very simple cartoon faces. As you read these words, I'm sorry, going across, you really hear them in your mind very differently. You know, one is sarcastic, one is heartfelt, etc. No matter what, once you have a face, you have some kind of expression to it. There's no such thing as a entirely neutral face. So once you start putting faces into the interface, you can't simply say, okay, I've got this face, problem is done. You've opened up a huge set of things you have to deal with because that face will always be looking in a particular direction. So you have to think, how is your interface going to handle, where is it showing its attention? It's always going to have some kind of expression. You have to handle, how am I making that expression match what I wanted to say it? And it turns out that facial expression is an incredibly complex thing. There have been all these studies of smiles that our ability to read smiles, you know, how honest they are, dishonest, is very, very cute. It's interesting. It's even more complex than that because our tendency, we have a very, very acute tendency to read very subtle nuances into faces. We also actually tend to be quite wrong in what we read into faces in reality. So people's ability to tell if someone else is lying, if they're honest, is actually much lower than they believe. So there's actually tends to be a lot of agreement among people about what a face shows. So faces are problematic for many reasons. So what we decided to do was to take the ultra-minimalist approach and to start building a set of interfaces that would start trying to do work with graphics, but to build up from a very, very minimalist set of representations and see where we could go with that. The first piece we did in this series is called Chat Circles. I actually have it on the other machine. I'm going to try not to switch back and forth too much for continuity, but we can go through it in question and answer. This is actually a live application that you can, go back to our site at, when you have time and play around with. It runs. It's even downloadable by people in academic nonprofit institutions. So if anyone's interested, you can have your own server of it. But the idea here was you log in and you pick a color, and then you're represented by that color. And all of your words appear in this circle. And this is actually an early screenshot. We've changed it. Your name comes down on the side. So they're actually, which is nice, it's actually even more humanoid looking than you're seeing here. You see these little sort of lollipop figures with your name. But what's nice about it is the circles grow and shrink as you type in them. And so one of the things you see, first of all, is you can see the rhythm of the conversation. So where it's active, you see the words come out, then they fade away over time. So you get the sense of rhythm. And the other part is is this notion of hearing range. As you can see right here, you're seeing these circles, but some are larger. Obviously, someone's typing, but you only see words in here. So you only see the words of people. You see the circles growing and shrinking of everybody, but you only see the actual words of the ones that you're near. And so one of the advantages of that was, there were two things. We had first thought about it in the notion of threading. If you've ever been in an online chat, there's often 9 different conversations going, and so as you read it down, it doesn't make any sense because someone's responding to this person over here, but the other chat discussions have arisen in between. So what we wanted was to have something where you would move towards the people that you were talking to. What actually I think is a more interesting effect of this is it also starts giving you starts playing around with a little bit of gesture in an interesting way, because a lot of work with gesture tends to try and translate very directly, gestures that we use in real life, as copying the form as opposed to the function. And here, one of the things that happens, if you're at a party and you're talking to somebody and you realize that they're really boring, first your mind travels, and if someone's going like this when they're talking to you, you start thinking, I should get to the point now. And maybe this was the wrong joke to tell here, but you have a lot of feedback from other people, as they, do they move closer when you're speaking? This piece of gossip is really fabulous that you're telling, or are they kind of moving away? And here, one of the things that is incredibly hard online is it's hard to ignore people, like very simple social sanctions. When someone is being really obnoxious on a news group, you can't ignore them because everyone who's lurking is sort of as if they're ignoring someone. So you actually have these kind of funny pseudo gestures that evolve. I did a paper called Identity and Deception in the Online Community. One of the things I was looking at was just how do people create social sanctions. And first what they would do is they'd make kill files so that they can't see the postings of this person. Then everyone realized, well, you ignore someone in a context in which you're invisible. An invisible person ignoring you is not particularly a damning sensation. So then they'd like write these long letters saying, I'm ignoring you, which isn't particularly effective. It's like calling someone up to hang up on them. So the notion here was that we would at least be able to, move away from people and is to use the screen, thank you for letting me know, to be able to use the screen more effectively to show conversational groupings, etc. This just shows, the next one just shows the same, okay. Hello. Given that my battery is so charged, you would think it would behave. There. So this just shows the movement there. This is another piece in this that you could see if you try out the system. We also want to have a very simple method of showing the history of the conversation. So when you can move between the history and the other form, this is somewhat less social, but it's nice also for giving you a sense of how you can use this with other applications, where anything that's bright are pieces of are other people. Each person who's logged in has a line here. When you run your mouse over these, what the text of it was pops up on the screen, and if it's not bright, it means, well, it happened, but you weren't in hearing range, so you can't hear it, you can't read it now. But you can sort of go over, so if you're paying attention to something else, you can go back and forth and still see the history of it. That whole notion of like whether you could see things that people had written that you weren't in hearing range of, etc. We made particular design decisions in this particular application, but sort of by taking such a minimalist stand, some of the interesting pieces are to think about what other ways would you want to implement some of this. For instance, right now this has this whole sort of big black plain background, and starting to think about what are the other directions you might want to take it in. So one of the areas I've been interested in is right now, like if you look at a lot of graphical MUDs, they have these backgrounds and they're very elaborate, but they don't do anything. One of the things that I always find absurd are these systems where people say, well, we're going to build an environment that's going to be a meeting room online for all these people. So then they build in something that looks like this. It has all these chairs. And it's like, well, that's a meeting room. There's a chair, and your avatar can sit in a chair. And it's like, that's completely missing the point. A chair is really useful when you have legs and you weigh a certain amount and you want to sit. It's not particularly useful for an avatar. It doesn't really think about what kind of environment is important here. How does it make sense? So the sorts of things we were experimenting with there are perhaps having areas in the background where everything you say is visible. So unlike the other places where if people aren't within your hearing range, they can't hear you. These are sort of soapbox areas where everything you say is visible to everyone, even though you might not be able to see what they're saying, or the opposite, like anonymity areas where you could speak anonymously, etc. So thinking about what types of sort of physical virtual spaces start to make sense for the background. And a related project that actually does start to investigate some of these is this piece called Talking in Circles. This one is also a running and working piece, though it's not as accessible since it runs on the M-bone. This one started by taking the chat circles notion, and excuse the sort of smiley faces. The student who did that, we have some aesthetic differences, but I'll explain them in a minute. But anyway, took a lot of the ideas from chat circles, but one of the things, just a lot of what we look at are when do you want to use text, when do you want to use other things. My belief is that text as a form of communication works very, very well asynchronously. Things like email and news groups, I think, are going to be very, very, very long-lasting forms of communication. I think it's not particularly useful for synchronous communication. I think people madly typing at each other at the same time is a pretty limited piece, and that for that, voice and speech is really a lot more useful. And what we've done here is we've made a voice interface for chat circles, but it goes beyond that. The way this one works, you pick your color, you go in your circle, and these inner circles these bright inner circles show who's speaking, which seems very simple. So what it does, it just looks at the amplitude of the voice signal coming across, and it goes like this as you're speaking, and it, up and down very, very quickly, or not. You're not. And if there's no circle inside, it means there's no sound coming from that person's microphone. There's a couple of really nice things about it. One, if you've ever done large-scale audio conferencing, it's really hard to tell who's speaking. Even if you know the people well, it's hard to separate, if there's like 7 people. A lot of times there are people you don't know. You have no idea who's there, what's going on. And here, what you can see instantly who's speaking. We ran some experiments of just running radio announcers through it, and even with 3 or 4 of them speaking simultaneously, you could still follow one particular voice. So it's actually a very nice way of figuring out who's speaking. It also has that same notion of hearing range, though. In this system, it's much more of a curve. There's a fairly large space where you hear the other person, very well. So you can have conversational groups of about 5 to 6 that can all hear each other well. And then it starts to fall off, and people get softer and softer. So one of the things that's actually kind of nice is you can have people all talking at different places through this audio conferencing system. You're having some discussion, then 2 people are trying to deal with some logistical question. They can just go off to the corner of the screen together, have a private conversation because they're outside of everyone else's hearing range, have their little discussion, and then just move themselves back to the main part and join the conversation again. So it's a very, very naturalistic interface. We've also, the smiley faces and everything here. One of the things we wanted to experiment with here was the notion of, again, thinking about what gesture is. So now that you don't have the text showing up in the circle, you have the circle. It's not doing that much. You have the bright center moving in. So what we did was we said you can draw on the circle. So the ideal interface for this is a stylus. Or here you can make pictures in advance and click on them with the mouse. And what we're interested in seeing is how much do people use this as sort of back channel communication. Right now, if you sit in a meeting, not everyone does this. Some people just sit there. But some people are always nodding their head, or some people are going... some people really feel this constant need to communicate all the time. So one of the things with this is it gives you this very simple method of not necessarily interrupting, but if you like what someone's saying, would you just write yes? And again, it just fades away after a few seconds. You might write yes, maybe use a smiling face. You might, if you weren't sure of what they're saying, use a question mark. But starting to see if there's ways of using just this ability to essentially doodle, have this own space in which you can doodle, not only to provide information, but one of the things we're interested in seeing over longer trials is will this also start to give you some sense of the people you're with? Because right now, it's not as if you sit there and say, oh, I remember so-and-so just sort of sits very serenely, whereas like someone else is always flailing, moving their arms and jiggling their feet. But it's part of how you get a sense of others. So it was mainly just to give people another medium in which to communicate, even if it wouldn't be important key ideas, but that you would get a sense of, is this person always doodling something or drawing something, or these people never use that? And finally, what we were doing here with the background was, in this case, what we wanted to do is just put sounds in the space. We're a lot of the work here is inspired by, there's a writer named William White who did these really interesting studies of how people move around in the city. And his work is great. He has books in print. He has one called City. He has some videos that are wonderful. But he spent years videotaping people on city plazas. And he discovered all these interesting things. He found that, yes, people actually do tend to stand in doorways, in the entrances of subways, and hold long conversations. Like your sensation that people are always just standing in the way, it turns out is true. And he has all these great videos of people. After years, he has videotapes of what do people do when they're embracing in public? And he's all these videotapes of these people hugging and one of them looking at their watch. So they're just wonderful to look at. But a lot of what he's interested in was just how people move around in space. Now, for those of you who are familiar with New York, actually the redevelopment of Bryant Park was done based on his theories and turned out to be this amazingly successful urban redevelopment. But in his case, a lot of what he's interested in is, like he said, people really want to have food. They need places to sit. They need to be able to adjust their seats and everything. What we've been trying to do is take a lot of those notions and say what makes sense in the online world for that. Obviously, you don't want to have pictures of hot dogs. It's amazing how literal some designs can be. But what you do want to do is think about what makes people comfortable in a space, or how do you start defining something besides having this big black empty space? So here we were working with different types of information. There is basically a news stream that comes through as background, and is a jukebox that you can pick different music in. And one of the things that's nice about that is a lot of times if you go into, say, a chat space, there's nothing there. If you go in, there's like one other person there. People are sitting there saying, well, so what's new? Not much is happening. And here, what you could do is it gives you a reason to be in that space besides simply starting up a conversation with people you don't know. So here we're trying to say, well, it's an information space. This at least provides information context. It gives you a reason to still hang out there if there's no one around until people appear, etc. So it's the start of thinking about what some of the background formation is. This is this is a very early work. This was actually just started about a month ago. And the interface itself isn't that fabulous, but it's a third piece. Just as a design talk, I thought it would be interesting to look at another branch that we're taking this work is here. What we're trying to do is add behaviors to the shapes because, we said this was going to be a minimalist start to things. We don't really believe that the be-all and end-all representation of human beings is the colored circle. But what we wanted to do was to start thinking about how can we start to evolve things that aren't typical avatars. So what this student is going to be working on is looking at a set of sort of basic behaviors. We're starting with things, doing some of the, I don't know how many of you are familiar with like the Disney squash and stretch experiments and things, but looking at what are some interesting sets of behaviors to give a simple shape that you can program through some very simple scripting that will start giving more character to it without saying, okay, well, I'm going to pick this face that has a smile on it. So some of the things we're doing, like some of the type examples of behaviors are something where if you stand near someone for a long time, do you take on their color or do you go to an opposite color? Some things about personal space. What does it do automatically if people get close to it? There's ones that let others overlap, ones that push back, ones that move away, abilities to follow. So things that to start basically experimenting with a vocabulary of behaviors so that it gives us a new way of thinking about what are some of the things you might put into self-representations other than drawing faces and avatars. I just want to talk so quickly about a couple of, this is a different conversational piece we did just to open up the thoughts about what conversations are, because one of our basic beliefs is that sitting hunched over a computer, I'm interested in how people are going to communicate online. Sitting over a computer, typing things at it is not, I don't think, the end, this big future of communication. It's a little depressing. So some of what we think about a lot are how we start moving some of these pieces into real-world environments. There's a piece called Visiphone that was shown at SIGGRAPH last year, and what the more interesting in some ways than the solution is just the problem we were looking at as a design issue was looking at domestic spaces where right now the problem we were looking at was how would you connect two kitchens? If people are going to speak casually with each other, what's the right interface for doing that? And one of the things that was very interesting to me is that when you're talking on the telephone, telephones don't really allow for pauses very well. It's really awkward if you're speaking to someone and you don't talk for 5 minutes. You're usually like in a horrible fight with them. But if you're basically, if you're hanging out in the kitchen with someone, you might be doing something, they might be doing something. You talk, you go back to what you're doing, and you talk, and there's some pauses. So if you want to connect two spaces like that, how do you do that? So you don't want to just be on a phone because that takes up more attention. You could say, well, speakerphone is a little bit easier, but a speakerphone, once you have any kind of pause, in some ways is worse because either you feel very awkward about pauses and it's just like a phone, you have to keep up a constant conversation, or it's very easy to forget it's there. And it's not very nice to have, for instance, your kitchen connected with this audio portal to another space that you then forget about. You like to know what connections are there. So we thought we'd like to do some kind of visual interface to that type of speakerphone-like thing. What this does is it turns on when there's a connection. It's this domes of varying sizes, and there's little dots that go around. And when there's sound coming from my end, the dots are blue. When the sound is coming from your end, it's orange. And they can combine together. So a couple of things it does is this just shows a little bit, I think, of how that works. So here's just how it combines into one piece. But so the movement itself reminds you that there's something happening there. People said they found it really mesmerizing because it's sort of like a lava lamp, and it goes around and around. But it lets you know, for instance, if you're not paying attention, you have little gray dots when there's no sound, and all of a sudden there'll be like this orange blast out of the corner of your eye. So even if there's a lot of ambient noise where you are, it does give you the same way that if someone starts gesticulating, it gives you something out of the corner of your eye to draw your attention. It also gives you some feedback of how well your voice is carrying to the speaker by just seeing, if it's picking up on you based on how it adjusts to the ambience of the room. And that we thought was fine. What was kind of interesting about showing it at SIGGRAPH to all these people was how many people said, oh, this is so wonderful because it shows how much I'm being interrupted by somebody else. Because when you have the colors together, it's like, I want to show this to my wife because she doesn't believe that she interrupts me all the time. So a little bit of like unintended uses for things. But it's just sort of an example of thinking about what kinds of things exist in physical spaces, which I'm going to return to at the end of the talk. But I think one of the most important things for me was that notion that, especially if you want to talk to people, you can't just talk to the ether. And that one of the things that was most useful about it was, it gave you a focus. If there's this other space somewhere, it gave you this focus of a thing to talk to, which is, people who use speakerphones know this too. You have a tendency to talk to the object. But what was kind of nice here was that most speakerphones, they try and make them a little biomorphic, but that they're not particularly lively things. And here, by having this this motion, it's actually very pleasant looking. It gets into what I'm going to start talking about next, which is what we call social visualization, is that while it's not a representation of this other person, and it certainly doesn't pretend to know anything about what your conversation is about, by something about the circular forms, the spirals, and the animation does seem like a better focus and stand-in for this other place. Though it's abstract, it does feel animated in the sense of there being something alive and something there. So, which brings me to sort of the next area. I will be quick here, but it's interesting with scientific visualization and social visualization. And Donna's talk, I think, showed us a lot of the complexity in artwork in scientific visualization. And so I'm still going to try and contrast it, but it's, I think the contrast is less strong given that context of a very artistic way of approaching visualization. But one of the goals of this area that I'm calling social visualization is that right now, when you look at most computers, you have very little sense that they connect you to millions of other people. And you have very little sense of that crowd, whether it's a small crowd, you might be talking about a small group of people, or those millions. You just don't have much sense of that. What I'm interested in here is starting to develop systems that give you not just that sense of that, but also start thinking about what visualization means when you're trying to represent the feel of a community as opposed to data. And I think one of the biggest differences, and actually the pieces I'm going to be showing you here don't really begin to address this, but I think the big question we need to be looking at here is this is a field in which it's often not how well you visualize quantitatively the material, but how well your visualization captures the feel of it. And in some ways what I'm going to show you are some baby steps that utterly fail at doing that, but it will at least give you some idea of some possible directions. First piece I'm going to be showing you, and this is an introduction to it, is a piece called Visual Who, which will be shown in a big mega version called Laser Who at SIGGRAPH this summer. But what these are here is, this is a little snippet of our mail alias file at the Media Lab, and it's a humongous file. And this is the UTemp file, which shows logins on a system. Now, shown like this, these are not particularly interesting pieces of, you don't get the sense of a fabulous, vast, intricate community here. But between these two sets of data, you have actually a huge amount about the structure of the community. This and the piece I'm going to show you is mostly a visualization of these mail aliases at the Media Lab, which is a real email culture, but a lot of companies and organizations are moving in that direction now. There's mail aliases for everything. Every research group has one. There's aliases. People make mailing lists when they have a class. There's mailing lists for every interest. People who use Linux have a mailing list. People who use SGIs, people who do DSP. People make mailing lists when they're having a barbecue, and then they leave them around in perpetuity. So you can kind of see who everyone's friends are, et cetera. But it's all in this list and not in a form that anyone's really going to read. And here, you see the rhythms of people logging in and out. What I was interested in doing was being able to visualize this information in a way that would actually make sense. And this is from the Laser Who interface. We've now moved this into this big multimedia laser screen, which will be at SIGGRAPH, but I'm going to go through just the interface part. And the idea behind it had come to me one summer when I was working in Japan and feeling very lonely a lot of the time. And I would always log in and see who is logged in here, to Media Lab. Because I just wanted to have the sense of like some of my friends, someone who spoke my language, who understood me, who was also online at the same time. Even if I wasn't going to do anything about it, just was this feeling of connectedness, of presence. And it would be so great to have this window that I could just see these names coming up and disappearing as they logged out. When I came back, I decided I wanted to build that. And then you start coming up with this problem, well, where do you put the names? Well, if you put them in alphabetical order, it's going to look like a memorial, which is what I wanted. And then if you say, well, these people work on the 3rd floor and these people work on the 4th floor, you have this huge handmade data set, and it actually doesn't fit lots of people because there's alumni, and that's not really relevant. So I thought, that's when I started thinking about using this alias file, and then how could I use that to visualize them? And that's what Visual Who came to be. And the way it works is, this is from an older version that ran on one very specific graphics card. And we are now porting it to Windows, and hopefully within a few weeks there will be a live applet that you can play around with, so you should be able to play with this yourself. But these are all old screenshots from it. What you can do is you could take any of those lists. From this database, there was about 2,500 mailing lists. You could pick one of those lists, put it up on the screen, and all the names which started in the middle would start streaming towards it. And then you could put up another one, and they would start streaming between them. Then you could put a third one up, and they'd start streaming out towards it, like as if they were attached by rubber bands. And this is sort of what it will eventually do is settle out. No one would be beyond here because it's like rubber bands overshooting. And the way that it works is basically when you pick a mailing list, so you say, okay, softball, say there's 15 people on the softball list. What it would do is it would say, okay, who's actually on the softball list? So take those 15 people, and they would say, okay, what lists are these people on? And from this, it can derive basically a profile of the prototypical member of the softball list in terms of their list membership. It then takes that prototype and compares it to everybody's email membership. And so it can see how similar you are to that particular prototype, and then it essentially attaches a rubber band between each name and the list, and the strength of that rubber band has to do with how similar they are to the prototypical member of that list. So when you have 3 anchors up, everyone has these 3 different rubber bands attached to them. And so where they end up has to do with how much they're pulled by these different lists. When you click on one of these names again, it disappears, and you can add others on. Because one of the things that turns out is that you can think about a database like this as having 2,500 dimensions. There's not one right way to visualize it. So what I wanted to do is make something that made it very, very, very easy to explore these relationships, so that you would learn over time by playing around with it what were some of the interesting things and what weren't. You also can set the colors to be actual membership and lists. So here they're set to be 4 different things that are particularly salient for the Media Lab. All of the faculty, if you're looking for familiar names, they're all changed for anonymity for public view. But all of the faculty are yellow, all the grad students are red, support staff is the purple, green were undergrads, and blue were anyone who wasn't on those lists. But it knows who the people in those different roles are, because being the Media Lab, there's a list for each of one of those things. If what you're interested in was sports, we could have said, okay, let's make everyone blue by default, and the softball players, we'll color those white, and we'll make the people on the Frisbee list yellow. You can pick any list that you want that way. So what was nice about this is it lets you start to play around with really understanding the structure of a community. And the things I talked about before about saying, well, what does it do about how, the feel of the community, it doesn't really start to address this. And that's some of the things I want to be working on is, how do you move in that direction? Because, well, I'd like to get this software to a point where we can distribute it. But if I give it to you, and if I give it to IBM, and if I give it to, any other group, it's going to look like this. It doesn't really address those issues, but it does do an interesting thing about letting you play around with, at least as a member of that community, really starting to see how different people fit in, what the different relationships are, etc. It also lets us, and it finally let me build that window that I wanted to build, because you could then, for instance, in this case, filter it through looking at who was logged on when. So this shows one layout, and then it's the same layout. That was looking at 4 in the morning. This is at 1 in the afternoon. And here the brightness was how recently people had been active, and the dull ones were idle, and ones who weren't logged in aren't there. So here you'd have something where it would look at the logins every 5 minutes, and you'd actually start to see patterns of people popping in. You'd see classes letting out, and all the people going and checking their email and stuff. But what, in some ways, I think this gets a little bit closer to that, because it starts really addressing some of those questions about what actually is presence. In an online world. One of the things that I'm very interested in is that whole notion of, if this computer is connecting with people, how much does a very minimal system like this really start to tell you about that feeling of presence, when you can just know that someone else is connected somewhere? What are some of the other things that you really need to know in order to have a full sense of it? I want to show you one other thing. This is a piece where this is a very early sketch for a piece that I think is going to be very interesting. And again, this has not yet solved a lot of the really important design problems, but at least going through these very early sketches will help you see what some of the issues are here. This we're completely revamping, in the process of completely redesigning. But this piece is called Loom. And what we're interested in here is doing newsgroup visualizations. And the thing with newsgroups is there's thousands and thousands and thousands of them. And they're fascinating because you have this exact same interface right now that supports communities with vastly different habits, mores, all kinds of things that develop very differently. Some newsgroup communities are really supportive. They're communities for people who all have arthritis or have had suffered through something. They're really supportive places. There are others that are very, very factual, and they're about exchanging information about particular interfaces. Others are these long arguments. Some of them are these really puerile gathering places for 13-year-old social misfits. And they have this whole range of things. They have very, very different behaviors, but they all share the same interface. And here we're really interested in the problem of saying, if we could, right now, if you want to look at the list of newsgroups, you get this list, and they all have these very hierarchical names, and they all look just the same. And what I was interested in saying, well, right now, in the real world, for instance, if you're going to go out to dinner, you can pop your head into a restaurant and you see, if you see bright plastic surfaces and fluorescent lights and everything, you know that if you're in a hurry, you're in the right place. If you would like to ask somebody to marry you, it's not where you would like to be. You want something with these tablecloths and everything. But as a restaurant owner, it's not that one is right and one is wrong. When you open a restaurant, you know a huge amount about this whole vocabulary of design that lets you make these choices about what type of place you want. If you want to have fast turnover, you want to attract a lot of kids and everything, it's plastic. There's things you do to make people leave. If you want to have people spend 4 hours, there's a whole other set of choices that you make. And so what we were interested here is to say, can we start thinking about how to design at least a way of visualizing these different news groups so that you'd have a very visual sense of what type of places they each are. We haven't gotten at it yet here, but I'll just show you some of the pieces of data that we can bring up. They're really interesting here. This is just the simplest one thing we could come up with, where we looked at a group and we said, okay, let's just, each of these dots, each line is a person and each dot is a posting. But one of the things you can see right away is there's a couple of people who dominate this group, and there's someone who dominates it quite a bit, which is something that's actually very hard to tell, if you go into a group like this. So even just simply saying, okay, we could start seeing some of these patterns of who's there by that. One of the things we're moving on to now is doing different analyses on population, and then thinking of a much more compact way of representing it than one dot per posting, and looking at things such as, does this group have lots of returning people who come back time after time again, or is it a big population of people who appear once, ask a question, and then are never seen again. Then another thing we can look at is, for instance, threading. How dense the different threads are. This is two different groups. This is comp.lang.java.graphical user interface, and this is soc.culture.greece. And it's a little hard to see from these slides, but here you have, we just do lines to connect threads. And here's another line here and a couple here. So what you're seeing here is typical of a group that's really about asking a question. People come in, they have a question, they ask it, someone answers. Someone else might say, oh, I did it this way too, or something else. But 2 or 3 levels deep in, that's pretty much it. This one, if you start following it, there's pieces that go up and down and back and forth and everything. This is an incredibly argumentative news group. Greece and Turkey have been at war on and off for millennia. And this news group is filled with Greeks and Turks, reliving every single piece of that over and over and over. And it's basically one huge argument that was started, I think, in the late 80s, and has been going pretty steadily ever since then. But even, again, this is not the right piece of it, but just at a glance, starting to see that you can see these different rhythms. What we have now is we're really rethinking a lot of the visualization issues of how do you really want to show that difference in the density of the conversation. So once you start seeing the difference in the density, the differences in the population, whereas the Java one tends to have a couple of experts and then lots of transient users, whereas the Greek one is a larger nucleus of continuously participating people, you start to see some of the elements that can give you visualizations that start to feel very different. Then there's also some of the things that are interesting to look at a more micro level. Here this is the same data as that first slide. This is from that Greek news group. And here we have the threads, and then we also said, okay, it's 1 dot per posting, but white are new postings and red are replies to other postings. So now one of the things you can see at a glance that you normally would have a while is that one user who's such a participant is not actually a participant in the group at all. This person has never replied to anything anyone else said. They're just, it could actually be like an automatic robot or something that's just spewing out information, and none of the threads go through it. So this is this thing that participates in it, but that posts to it, but is non-participatory. And then you can start seeing the difference between some of the other more frequent users who seem to be very much intertwined with the conversation, the threads. People answer them, they answer other people, versus ones that, while they're probably not robots, they are replying, aren't really deeply into it, that's probably somebody who everyone's ignoring at this point. So you start seeing some of the, so starting to see some of the things you want to look at a more micro level to get a sense of who's who. There's just a couple of other things I wanted to talk about quickly. This is more of a study, and I'm going to talk more about designs. Just a quick notion, if anyone's interested, you can come to our website and find out more. This is an analysis of fashion on the net, of trying to understand, if you look at the web, actually we'll talk about this for one quick second. If you look at the web, one of the things about fashion that's really interesting, since you are design people, and fashion is maybe not what you're designing, but something that people may be interested in. If you look at the history of fashion, one of the ways of looking at it is that it has a big information component to it, that basically the fashion changes faster the easier it is for people to exchange information. In theory, though I don't think the web is nearly at this level of sophisticated culture yet, in theory there should be a vast amount of fashion online. When I say fashion, I'm not talking about just about clothing. A good way of thinking about it is media fashion, like music, where you look at something like club music where hit songs will change every week. If you look at a lot of dance clubs, like a song will just be out a week after it's released. And I think a lot of what's very interesting about that is not that it says, oh, children today have no attention span, which is I think how some people read it, but that it's really about a world in which information travels really fast, and the information that's encoded into, say, a DJ's playing particular type of music is his or her place in this whole distribution of information and media. And so this whole system that says, I know enough to play this song and I have access to this song, has a lot to do with being a display of your position in an information distribution hierarchy. So that's another long disquisition. We can go through a question and answer if anyone is slightest bit interested. But so the theory is that online, this should start to appear in certain environments. And what we've done here is this year-and-a-half study of GeoCities, the Media Lab's homepage is a sort of sanity check, some random homepages, and 2 different sites within GeoCities to look at how just pulling in every single link and looking at what things were linked to and linked from, and analyzing how clumps and clusters of people changed things at the same time to see if there was actually any emerging online fashion, which we actually think we're starting to see much more in realms such as GeoCities. Just for the sake of time, I'm going to just say one of the things we're interested in is visualizing how people move through websites. And I just want to finish up with some of our last piece here and talk about some of the things we're interested in doing in real-world spaces, just to bring back that thread. Here's a piece that we're in the midst of developing called Here and There. And the idea here is to do audio augmented reality. And I know a lot of you have seen some augmented reality pieces that are very visual. And we thought that for daily life, there's a couple of problems with this. People don't tend to distance themselves from what's around them visually. But the auditory world, I mean, you see people walking around with Walkmans and cell phones and everything all the time. So the notion of being simultaneously in a virtual and real-world space auditorially seemed to make sense. And in theory, though, when I show you our little setup, you'll think this is not the most graceful thing. But in theory, we'll have a much smaller version that it also... Just in a minute, I'll get to that. So the idea here, what we were interested in is authorable augmented reality, because what the sort of dream vision I had here was of something where you could go around and give, for instance, oral histories of spaces, of saying, okay, I can just go and record what I know about this neighborhood or this house or this story that happened here, and then leave that information in space. So some of the problems we're dealing with beyond numerous technical issues are how you link these spaces. If you think, because what our sort of grand plan is to be like the web of these augmented audio spaces, because if you think about, one of the things that was so exciting about the web was it was very authorable. Like, the thing that was so cool about it was, the web came out anybody could put up a page, and it was really easy because one of the things you could do is copy someone else's page, grab it, change the words, and put it up. You didn't have to learn HTML until you were so irritated with the fact that yours had this bright green background that you went and learned how to change backgrounds and things like that. So what we're working on here is a model very much like that, where there's a whole sort of sculpting and shape model that you can go to, but you can grab other sculpted audio shapes. Because remember, one of the things that's very exciting about putting audio in space is when you hear a sound in real life, you know, if you hear my meager way of snapping my fingers, how well you can hear that, or if you can't hear it at all, has to do with how loud it was and how far you are. But if you're putting sound into a virtual space, you can make that envelope into anything you want. You can say, okay, this sound has an envelope like this. You're going to walk into it, and there it is. It's not going to gradually fall off. Or you can make it gradually fall off all you want. Or you could say, well, we really want to think about sound as this whole sculpture, so that what I'm going to do is have a longer piece in the middle, but have it surrounded by an introduction or a prelude or something like that. So once you start having synthetic audio in a space, you're really thinking of this in terms of an audio sculpture. So we wanted to make it both authorable, but also very artistic. So we have it authorable. You can go and record something. But the other piece of it, it's not that artistic yet. It turns out that GPS units that advertise themselves by being very large, that they have a 1 centimeter accuracy. It turns out it may be on Mars, it may be in some other atmosphere, but it's not. It doesn't turn out to work that way in our atmosphere. But anyway, so the idea here is that you can go and you have these different sound spots. Once you've recorded them, you can move them around. You can link them, because if just say everyone is going around authoring sound and oral histories in space, you don't want to hear all of them all the time. So what we're looking at are what is the structure of essentially activation networks for being able to put narratives together, have them linked to each other, etc. The current system looks like this, because we went and bought this incredibly expensive, supposedly 1 centimeter in accuracy system so we could build these fabulous sound sculptures, and it turns out that it's actually a meter, which doesn't really work for this kind of sculpting. So we're building a whole set of accelerometers so that you trigger something so that actual space isn't the same. But this does work. And just thinking, so now we're really at least starting to, while we can't do a lot of the perceptual experiments with this notion of sound sculpture, we can leave a sound in a space and start working on that whole structuring, how you move through a space that has these different sounds. Really, and just simply what does it feel like to walk through an outdoor space, find sounds, when do you want to have some kind of visual interface to direct you, when is the sound interface alone sufficient, etc. And that's it. This is the URL of my group, so if anyone is interested we have papers, we have projects, students' email addresses, etc., that's where you would find it. So anyway, thank you.
Some of these in action, and I think that the movement of them is really important to see. Then you start to get the whole rhythm and patterning that goes on. So I'd love to see. I don't know if you end up having videotapes or.
I don't have video. I can, while we're doing questions, I can put a couple of pieces up. I did it. Voila. This is the actual Chat Circles interface. I was actually going to show you. This is a piece I skipped over, saying, oh, this is our web visualizations, but it does have some, at least animation in it in theory. This is just showing, this looks at logs of this goes through the log of a website and shows different people moving through. This was actually a student's work in class, so it's not even a full-fledged research project, but just that sensation of, these are a bunch of different pages on a site and seeing the people moving through them. But you were thinking more visual who, I know. You have to go to SIGGRAPH and then you can see it.
But it seems that when you're doing things on the screen, you're staying with it two-dimensional, so two and a half dimensional format. And then what you were saying about a recent direction of dealing with physical spaces, where in this case you're talking about an audio stuff. Are you thinking at all about visual stuff in the physical space?
Well, Visiphone dealt with that a little bit. We are.
I mean, I think it's a really hard problem.
Yeah, well, I think there it's interesting because it gets into a